And to the analysis of Shields and Brooks, that's syndicated columnist Mark Shields and New York Times columnist David Brooks. So here we are at the end of 2017. There seems to be some data out that talks about this year of polarity or increased polarization. I mean, what party you are seems to determine so much more than how you view the world today than what gender you are, where you went to school, what church you belong to.
No, I don't think there's any question that our parties have become far more monolithic than they were just 2 generations ago. I mean, 2 generations ago, the pro-choice position on abortion was led by Planned Parenthood by Republicans. I mean, and the Democrats were, if anything, a pro-life party on guns, on a whole host of issues, social issues. There was cross-pollination between the 2 parties. Now they become far more monolithic. I, for one, am a little bit of a heretic on the subject of the total polarization of us as a society. I think people decide where they live, not necessarily on the voting patterns as much as how good the schools are, how much of a commute it is, how safe the neighborhood is. But I don't think there's any question that there's greater political polarization, and there's a greater willingness now to think that my political opponent is my enemy rather than just my adversary.
Yeah, I'm a little more pessimistic. In 1960, they asked people, would you mind if your son or daughter married somebody from the opposing party? And it was like 5% said they'd mind. Now it's like 40% say they mind. If you ask people, what do you think, if you ask Republicans, what do you think of Democrats? Democrats, what do you think of Republicans? The same words come out. The people in the other party are immoral, they're lazy, they're stupid, they're closed-minded. And so this is a pretty big separation, and I think it's it's not just a political identity so much anymore. It's a social identity. It's who you are, and I do think people are moving to people like themselves, part of the same political tribe. And politics is now aligned with TV viewing habits, with prayer, church attendance, with all sorts of other activities. It's now tribal, and the tribal is basically political. And to me, that's just putting too much weight on politics. So
as our co-captains of civility, those who disagree agreeably, right, what do we do about it?
I disagree with David, and I'm not going to be civil about it. Okay? No, I do think there's majority support in both parties. We've seen it in an improvement in the country in questions of racial tolerance, acceptance with interracial marriage, acceptance of sexual minorities, so I mean there is. I mean, in both parties, immigration, Republicans by 20% think that immigration is better for the country rather than worse than 20 years ago. And I'm not minimizing. I'm not trying to be a Pollyanna, but I think that the areas of disagreement are more intense and more polarized. But what would I do about it? What I do, I take from personal experience. The first time I ever slept in the same quarters with African Americans or took orders as a direct matter of course, from African Americans was at Parris Island, South Carolina, Marine Corps boot camp. I think that was a great Americanization. I think national service is a great Americanizing experience. I think we have, in both parties, but particularly in my own party, the Democratic Party, there's been an overemphasis on my rights as a citizen. And I think our duties and responsibilities as a citizen have to be addressed. And the idea that that's the way we understand our differences, and yet understand our commonality. And I would say mandatory, universal at the age of 18 for everybody, civilian and military.
I agree with that. I do 2 things. One, I try to downplay politics. Politics is an important thing. We make our living talking about it, but it's not the most important thing. Most of the things that matter in life are your relationships, your community, what your ideas, your character, and those are sub-political. And Mark is progressive. He's got way worse problems than that. He's a Boston Celtics fan.
I am
worse. And so first down, politics is a limited activity, important but limited. The second thing I do is try to discover something we actually do have in common, which is a national story. I was raised, my grandfather had big immigrant mentality. It was an Exodus story. Our people, like all Americans of all different types, left oppression, crossed the wilderness, came to the promised land. And that was the national story that a lot of different people could buy into. And for people under 40, that's just not their story. They just don't buy it. They don't think there's a promised land, too much oppression, too many historical sins. So we've got to come up with a new historical story, and that's a challenge for us right now.
Agreeing with David, but let me add this if I could, Harry. If we left everything to the private sector and forgot politics and the public sector, and I'm not arguing with David about the overemphasis on politics, but we have to acknowledge and we have to celebrate what we have accomplished together. I mean, if we left it to the private sector, we'd still have slavery in this country. I mean, it's only through politics, the political process, and public will and public education and public morality that we decided to abolish slavery, that we abolished segregation, that we have saved our environment, that we have done everything we have to make ours a more just and humane and welcoming country. And, you know, I think the failure of our leadership, particularly the current leadership, who insists, Donald Trump in particular, to denigrate and demean all public service and all public action is a sin to this country, and to having any kind of common story or common pride or common sense of values of who we are and what we stand for.
Speaking of Donald Trump, would you, at the end of this year now, give him credit for some of the accomplishments that he says he's not getting credit for? The longest list of judicial nominees approved in the first year of a presidency, a significant tax reform plan.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I mean, tax reform, since, you know, Paul Ryan was in short pants, this has been his dream. I mean, and he's been the symbol of all Republicans on this. There's no question about it, an achievement. And one cannot in any way minimize the judicial appointments. I point out that Clarence Thomas has been sitting on the Supreme Court. Now, George Bush was elected 30 years ago, George W. Bush. Clarence Thomas is still a reasonably young and healthy man. So it's incredibly, incredibly important. If they're going to celebrate the economic difference, I just point out that the unemployment rate was 4.8% when Donald Trump took office. Some credit should go to his predecessor, who cut the unemployment rate, whose policies did, in half. From 10% down to 4.8. But no, I mean, I think you have to acknowledge Donald Trump's successes in the areas you mentioned.
You know, David, also there seems to be a distrust in institutions of all sorts. I mean, you've got only about 30% of Republicans who believe humans are impacting climate change. And the graphic that we have up on screen, should the media play a watchdog role? That was something in early 2016 that about 75% of Democrats and Republicans agreed that that was the role of the press. And now, at this point, this was, I think, in May that the Pew had this poll out, about 42% of Republicans feel that, 89% of Democrats feel that. You know, the president certainly adds fuel to this fire. I mean, he rails against the press, against the FBI, against climate science.
Yeah, well, you know, this is partly a media problem. We made ourselves vulnerable to this loss of faith among Republicans by not hiring Republicans. This used to be a working class profession, which people in both parties, it has increasingly become an Ivy League profession for people with progressive political views. And if you do that after a long number of time, you're just going to lose touch with part of the country, and they're going to lose touch with you. So that's partly shame on us, but it's partly shame on Donald Trump. It's very easy for political leaders to take nascent suspicions and exploit them into tribal conflicts. We see this around the world where politicians, people are living together in a place like Nairobi, a lot of different tribes living in the same place. They don't have violence for most of the time, but when the electoral campaigns happen, the politicians come in and incite the violence, and it's like setting off a spark. And Donald Trump is a genius at setting off these kind of sparks, and opposition to the media has replaced opposition to the Soviet Union in the Republican gospel.
So how do you rebuild trust in institutions at large?
Well, I think one of the things, you actually have to be out in actual contact with people. Second, I think you have to engage in common projects. It's one thing to all get together, but we can't just get together. The people who want to divide us have a theory about why we should be divided. And you can't beat a theory with a process. You have to have a counter theory. You have to have a theory about what makes America a nation, about what our institutions do in that nation. And it's, again, I go back to this thing, we need a common story where the institutions play a role in the lives of all the individual citizens.
You know, Mark, this was also a year of reckoning in different ways about both race and gender. When it came to race, there was an interesting Washington Post poll out. Was 2017 good or bad for race relations? And across the board, Democrat, Republican, Independent, 82% said it was bad. And then, of course, later in the second half of the year, we started looking at the gender disparities and the climate of sexual harassment that seems so deeply embedded in so many different workplaces and industries. How does this translate? Does this actually become something of a political issue that results in some sort of change at the polls next year?
Yes. Dante Cini of the Wall Street Journal pointed out this week that by a margin of 42% more college-educated women are voting Democrat over Republican heading into 2018. I think that's a direct consequence of the two parties, particularly of President Trump, first of all, his position, the Hollywood access, something that he apologized for twice and then attempted to deny that he had said on the third time. But there's no question that there is a reckoning. The Weinstein, Charlie Rose. I mean, when you see men of that stature and that prominence fall, there's no question that it's real. And I think the warning throughout our society, the lesson is there. I think it's there politically. As far as Charlottesville, is still an open wound on race in this country. And in none of these cases has the president shown any moral leadership or any ability to heal the wounds. I just come back to the fact that on the night that he won the presidency in 2012, Barack Obama stood there and he said, we, first of all, speaking of his opponent's father, who had been the governor of Michigan, and his mother, who had been a candidate for the Senate, he said, we salute George Romney and Lenore Romney and their son Mitt, because the Romney family's commitment to this country and to public service to give back to America is what we honor here tonight. Now, Donald Trump insists daily, almost hourly, of speaking about the crooked Hillary. He's never extended the open hand of friendship or anything of the sort, and there's no healing. There's no healing, and that a president is supposed to be a healer.
David?
Yeah, I think these, now I turn a little optimistic. What's happening on the sexual harassment to me is an utterly good thing, but it's painful at the moment. You got to go through the painful thing, but it's an utterly good renorming of how people should behave together in the workplace. And on racial matters, I think what's happening is where people are being more honest with each other. Some of it's noxious on the right, but most of it is just conversations we need to have. And I think it's an unveiling of what has been hidden for a long time. That is painful, but is part of overall progress.
All right, David Brooks, Mark Shields, thank you both.
Thank you, Harry.